welcome to another edition of the Scenic View podcast. I'm Jonathan Owens, your communications director, and we have the usual crew in here today. I'll start with Artis Watkins, the executive director of Scenic, is in the house, along with Suzanne Beasley, the government relations director, and Sam Klein, our podcast producer. Everyone's here and excited about the big podcast episode that's about to happen. How are you guys doing
excited.
today?
Let's go.
I feel like that was the smoothest intro you've ever done.
It was. You knew all of our names.
It's crazy whenever you prepare, I actually prepared today. So, yeah, I'm reading my Word document here. I'm very relaxed in here in the studio.
This
How about
new studio
is great.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah,
It's
but
worth it.
Sam, you did make it kind of chill, though. It does take our crazy edge off, and I'm not sure if that's good or bad. We'll find out.
We can add some other things to bring back our crazy edge. I don't know, get some awesome trinkets and plants to go in here.
Something.
Plants might be.
Yeah,
I like
plants.
plants.
That'll make us rowdy. Nothing like a plant.
Woo!
That's fills you
I
full
was
of energy.
rowdy at Home Depot last week, and I spent $140 on plants.
Welcome to adulthood.
Yeah.
Plants.
You can't walk
I was
in
so excited
someplace
about
like that
plants.
without. Yeah.
There's the question of the week. What's your favorite plant? Moving right along. So what happened this week at the legislature? We'll start with Suzanne, as always.
Yeah, so it was a busy week. The Senate had their bill filing deadline to meet last week. We got through that. This week, the House has their bill filing deadline, which late yesterday afternoon got extended through next week, but only for legislation that's already in the pipeline. It's simply that there are so many bills that have not been time-stamped with the principal clerk's office for them to get through all of those bills and assign a bill number. They need a little extra time. So if it's already in the pipeline, it'll go through next week. There's over 700 bills already that were filed this week, and I spoke with the principal clerk today, and he said they're expecting 1,000 and some change probably.
So what was the reason to extend it? Just because bill drafting is so swamped, or?
I don't think it's bill drafting, because this would be legislation that's already been written. You've already turned it in. It just hasn't had the timestamp and a bill number assigned to it. So they're going to run out of time before they give every piece of legislation a bill number. So
Gotcha.
Maybe that department is understaffed.
That's a possibility.
Well,
Vacancy rate at the
state employees, so probably.
That's a possibility. I mean, I've heard that there's a shortage of legislative assistants. So now, I'm sure it's across the board everywhere. So it's a busy week, reading bills, trying to keep up with things.
Did the House have their own version of the state hip hop song bill?
Did not see that, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. We still have several hundred bills.
Maybe like a J. Cole song. Because he's from Fayetteville, right?
Yep.
So,
Woo!
So no crazy bills that you've seen yet? I mean, some of them are crazy. You just don't want to.
Yeah, nothing new is at this point. We're still reading bills, so let me make that very clear that between committee meetings, after we get home from work, this afternoon, after this, Senate had adjourned, we're reading bills, trying not to get overloaded, all in one day, which will probably happen anyway because there'll be a dump at the end of next week. So, yeah.
It's a crazy business, feast or famine.
Speaking of feast or famine, you also have maybe a little information about the Senate's budget that's coming out?
Yeah, a little bit. We were successful in getting hold of Senator Lee and Senator Jackson, who are big co-chairs in the Senate, and they both confirmed that the Senate budget will come out before Easter. We heard an array of different times yesterday. I heard everything from next Monday to April 17th to just sometime before Easter. All of that's before Easter, so whenever. Obviously, they didn't share specifics of what's in that budget, but, as soon as we've got that kind of information, we'll share it with y'all. But it's coming soon.
And Senator Lee got a promotion this week, right?
He did. He is the new majority leader of the Senate.
Okay.
Congratulations, Senator Lee.
I guess we don't have any real news to report on pay raises or COLAs, which is always a hot topic for us, right?
Yeah, not until we know what's in the budget.
Although we do feel like there is a pretty good little movement over there to try to do better than Governor Stein's budget did, the 2%.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I have to point something out on this podcast because Kristen Walker, the governor's budget director, was on Colin Campbell's podcast. And she was saying the 2% plus one-time $1,000 bonus, which, as we talked about, wouldn't be $1,000 after tax, but that the 2% and the bonus equates to around a 3.6% for most state employees. That is not how bonuses work. They're not. That doesn't turn your raise into a bigger raise. Your raise is still just the 2%, because next year that part that was the bonus won't be there.
Yeah, don't
Yeah.
don't
Doesn't
confuse
change your
people that
salary. Yeah.
recurring salary is the same as a bonus.
Yes,
It's
Sam's got her hand up.
Do they think that 1,000 bonus is going to be added every month? Because that's not.
No, so they know it's not.
Yeah.
They just thought that's the way it should be looked at, and that's crazy talk.
I spoke about in one of my videos I did last week about how skewed that number is because Director Walker actually had said that in Appropriations Committee when they presented the governor's budget to the legislature. So, it's just a skewed number because recurring salary increases and one-time bonus money are two different pots of money.
Yep.
So you can't put them together and make it be something.
And if they weren't, if they're so alike, just give it all as recurring.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet they're not. That's why you're not giving it.
My thought was, what do you mean it's a 3.6%?
No. That's
Mm-mm.
it's just not.
It's
so
not.
to be clear.
If it's not recurring, then it's not.
But what concerns me though is legislators hearing that might feel like that's true. It's kind of a 3.6.
Yeah. It's not the first time that this kind of rhetoric
I hate it though.
because it's wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And Kristen Walker is very properly respected in what she does.
Right.
So it's tough to hear that because she knows a lot better than that about how bonuses work.
So another big thing that happened this week was Artis made her triumphant return to the legislature as
Triumphant return? Like what? A few days before that?
making a speech before the Senate Regulation Reform.
Regulatory Reform Committee.
And that was about the DAVE Act, which is the Senate's kind of attempt at government efficiency committee work, right?
Right. So we talked about this a little last week. We now have, there are actually 3 separate legislative committees that exist to look at studying, evaluating programs or agencies, anything government. So there's 3 in the legislature. The House has their DOGE-style effort. Governor Stein announced he was going to have an effort that wasn't really defined either, except that they're going to use a scalpel, not a chainsaw. And then yesterday in Reg Reform, we heard the DAVE Act, which would give the state auditor the power to, well, first of all, they said there would be positions involved. So the auditor's office would get a little bigger and that these people would look at agencies and vacant positions and determine, using in part AI, artificial intelligence, as a tool, which agencies and which vacant positions can be cut. And that rang a dozen different alarm bells for us. But that would make number 6 in terms of government committees on how to make government more efficient by spending money for all these efforts to try to make government less wasteful and more efficient. Really let that part sink in. There's 6 different efforts, none of which are free to do, all of which take taxpayer resources to try to figure out how to be more efficient.
So it's ironic that your committees looking for waste, fraud, and abuse are wasteful, fraudulent,
I mean,
and possibly abusive.
Oh, now, okay, I am not going to label them with those kind of pejorative monikers because I don't know. Somebody may do an amazing job, but the part that's not in any of this is the actual employees.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of them would have to rely in part on agency heads, or I don't know how far down the supervisor track in an agency they go to say, tell me about these jobs that are vacant. How important are they? But if you're using artificial intelligence, and Auditor Bullock did come to the committee and he said, we want to be data driven, basically, that it would all be assessed. The data would drive these decisions. But data can't tell you some things. Like, how is the AI going to tell somebody, hey, we don't only need more probation parole folks, but we also need them to have bulletproof vests that are of a higher quality than they have, or we'll have more people die the way they did in Charlotte in April when they were backing up U.S. Marshals.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a question about this, and it's kind of rhetorical, but it's serious as well. If the state auditor finds places where we actually need more state employees, do you think we'll ever hear about that?
Well, that's not what he's been charged with. And I don't know. Maybe he'll come back and say, yeah, we can't cut any of this stuff. Good grief, I looked at it, and it's kind of important. But I don't know. But AI is not likely to do that. But again, how does AI tell you? I mean, what do you plug in? Here's how many probation parole we need per 250,000 population. Somebody's got to plug things in. And that's the other question we had. what are the parameters? No one laid out anything about, other than he can use AI and we're going to give him more people to do it. Nobody said what the parameters of examination would be.
Yeah.
How can you know?
Yeah, and I thought as part of your speech, you said that this look at government efficiency is, what was that?
And it's position
Yeah.
efficiency.
It's actually
instead
looking
of-
for
yeah.
position.
People think government efficiency is is the number of state employees.
Yeah.
People think the government is the employees, period, that we're not spending money other than on state employees. If you ask somebody, that's really the first thing they think of. Well, we've got to pay the people. And okay, they might say, and the equipment they're working with, the building they're in, and that's it.
And that quote really struck a chord, I think, with all the reporters who were in the room, because a lot of them, they all used it in their stories. And then we posted it on Facebook and it got a lot of response as well. I mean, I think it's...
Well, think about all those. There's so many government contracts, either in the budget to non-governmental entities who literally get handed money from the state. Here you go. Boom. This is your money. And, a lot of people have things in their district that seem very important. And so they're doing their job as a legislator, try to get those resources back home. And sometimes that's to non-governmental entities who get funded in part or in whole by the government. Then you have the contracts that the agencies themselves put out for bid, and somebody wins that. They do the contract. And what we understand from employees in these departments, and that's what's going to make this so interesting to see what they find or don't, we hear all the time, there is absolutely not oversight over these contracts, that we would need a whole lot more people inside than we have to adequately supervise what we're paying other companies to do. And that, you got to think, nobody's going to want to do a government contract unless there's money to be made for the company. So,
yeah, I sent y'all another Jon Stewart podcast this week. I don't know if you've gotten to listen to it, but it had Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball, which is
I remember that. Yeah.
But now he's written a book about government employees, about public sector employees, and it's a really interesting.
How cool.
But one of the huge takeaways I took from that podcast was the statement that government exists to handle things the private sector won't do, which is kind of the crux of why we're here, right?
Right.
So he gave the example of rural broadband, like there's no market for broadband access that will be profitable for a private company, right?
Right.
So like prisons, there's things that the government, obviously that's why we support the people we do. The government does things that the private sector will not do, right?
That's true.
So,
or the private sector they'll do it, but only if there's enough money in it to pay people to do it and still have a good amount of profit left over.
So I guess what my argument is that you can't run government like a business. And that's kind of how all these efficiency efforts are kind of aimed at, making government profitable or getting to the bottom line.
Yeah.
So my thought was, as you said, the government is here to do the jobs that the private sector doesn't want to do. Then why are we contracting everything out to the private sector if that's what we are?
It's lucrative.
capable?
If you can get a good contract, it's very lucrative. And Look, I'm not hating on anybody who bids for these contracts and does them. The work needs to be done.
Yeah.
If it's chosen to contract it out. The beef I have about it is that it almost never is going to be cheaper nor more efficient and better quality than what you get out of your own internal people that you can literally supervise without a problem every day.
Because if it was, they would already do it.
That's it.
Exactly.
They would do it. You wouldn't need government to run a prison.
That's
or
Right.
Because you're paying extra people to do this as a contract rather than just paying the employees you already have more to do the job that they were hired to do.
And prisons are a great example. We had to take prisons back in North Carolina. They contracted some prisons decades ago, had to pull them back inside because it was a cluster. Because once it's not profitable, you're not going to run your company into the ground trying to maintain them at a certain level. But we are not alone. This is all over the country. People have prisons are a big one. Contracted out, you end up with either a lot of lawsuits, because at the end of the day, this is a whole other discussion, but the state does hold liability. No matter who does the work, you can bet that a good plaintiff's lawyer is going to make sure the state of North Carolina is one of the defendants, because that's the deep pockets.
Yeah, because the state is
who's ultimately responsible.
That's who put the person in prison. That's why they're in prison. So, but that's a huge like you said, another discussion
Yeah.
maybe for another podcast, just the whole issue of privatization. But I mean, obviously, this is probably, you think this will probably be like the biggest focus of our year?
I think it's very clear that with the governor and both chambers of the legislature having their own efficiency movements, that everybody is trying to, at least feels like there must be some big public outcry for just cutting jobs. At the end of the day, that's what no one has said yet. We're going to pull all these contracts and we're going to examine them deeply. No one has said that. Governor Stein's office didn't say that. They gave very little information except they're going to use a scalpel. And to be honest, when you're talking to state employees, they do not care if you're using a chainsaw or a scalpel because you can kill them either way.
Yeah.
And
That's a cut.
Yeah. And Representative Torbett, actually, when he was on our podcast, did say they would be open to looking at the contracts, but I don't know how much in terms of resources they have to do that work. So I do think there would be a desire there based on what he said, but I don't know if it'll end up something they can do. And then in the Senate, this Dave Act doesn't talk about that at all. Absolutely no reference to government in terms of government, just positions, vacant positions. And just a reminder, 20% over all of the positions are vacant, more than 60% in some of our prisons, but 20% across government. And they are not vacant, no matter what anybody says, because, people haven't been trying to fill them, because, just some sort of administrative buffoonery.
Yeah, well, it's just not attractive to come to work for the
Yeah,
state.
we don't pay enough.
Yeah.
When we're the third lowest paid in the country for our prison personnel, and we've heard this from when we put that thing up about prison personnel, we heard from I don't know how many other people working in state government saying we don't make as much as our counterparts in the Southeast either, and that wouldn't be a shock.
Yeah.
You said something earlier, or maybe it was the end of last week, that these stats have stuck in my head, though, relevant to all of this, that the population of North Carolina has actually grown in the last 15 years, 16%, and the government workforce has shrunk 24%. So you've got 24% fewer employees providing critical public services to 16% more population.
Yeah. Grover Norquist said years ago he wanted to drown government in a bathtub.
Yeah.
But what you've really seen at state government level around the country is more of a waterboarding of government, slow, awful.
Your metaphors are so great.
Waterboarding.
And I think it's important for us to always go back to perception of state employees. We talked about it last week. It's
always a challenge.
Yeah.
Just always a challenge.
But I think that it's kind of drives a lot of this government efficiency talk, that there's always such a bad perception of state employees. But they have to remember that the state employees don't set the policies. They don't fund the policy. I think that the people at the DMV, for example, would love to be able to do an awesome job with enough employees.
Why in the world would they not? Because people are coming in screaming at them. They're not screaming at legislators. They're screaming at the people in the DMV office who have not done a darn thing to start any trouble for the citizens. But the citizens are frustrated. And having worked for the state government at one point, I know we were told appropriately, hey, understand that people are just upset. When they call the government, it's not because things are going great. So be patient. You don't have to take a cussing out. You can politely ask them to talk to, I was with Department of Labor, ask them to speak to the commissioner about it and tell them you were instructed to hang up if people start cussing you out. But that was it. Otherwise, we were told you need to listen, and they're frustrated. And DMV people, we all go to DMV. We have to. Yeah. And we get frustrated too. But I don't know about y'all, I watch the people that work there and what's going on. And it's a terrible situation for them. But you're right, John. They didn't create it, but they have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think I just keep saying this just in random conversations with people. These cuts, these jobs on any level that are being cut, they are working people just like everybody else. So your neighbor who works for DOT, who may lose his job, or DHHS loses their job, they're working people just like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that affects the economy, first of all.
It does.
But, which is happening in North Carolina. The federal cuts have now, they're starting to hit home. And
there's the business right over here. I don't know if it's a business, but RTI deals a lot with the USAID contracts and things, and they've had lots of layoffs.
A lot of the grants and these things fund positions. So what you're going to have is a spike in unemployment in the state at the same time as there's going to be definitely less money coming into the state. We were talking to the speaker yesterday. I don't know how they're going to even write a budget. How do you write one not knowing what's coming down the pike? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How much of this is just kind of a copycat of what's going on at the federal level? Just wanting to win
I hope
some
a
of
lot.
those political points.
I hope a lot of it is, and I'll tell you why. Because this Doge mess that sounded like everybody's dream, everybody loved it, the public is souring hugely on it because it sounded good, and it's somebody who came from business with no governmental experience who said, this is what we're going to do. And it's causing, there's been some clusters as we went along. Nuclear scientists who, we need to put you back. Those kind of things have made the public unsure of the Doge effort, and that's good. That's appropriate because something like that shouldn't be done at warp speed, or that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to send some people home thinking you're making people happy because you're putting some tallies on the chalkboard in the cut column, but then the public's going to suffer from the lack of whatever important thing they did. And we gave newborn screening as an example yesterday because I can't think of anything that freaks me out more than delaying the treatment or diagnosis of terrible things with babies. And the bottom line is we weren't able at HHS for years to keep enough people in those positions to get those tests turned around as quickly as we used to. So literal newborns were going without needed treatment. That should just scare anyone.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, though, there's a million stories like that.
Yeah, that's where there's got to be a human element.
Yeah.
In all of this.
And the bottom line is if you want an efficient, effective government, you have to fund it, and you have to fund the positions for it and fund it well enough
to keep people for one thing.
Actually, I had someone who works in the correction community reached out to me on my Facebook page, and we were just talking about the step pay plan that the State Highway Patrol correctional officers have. And he wanted to know why someone in another position, why they don't have that. And we just got to talking about step pay plans in general. And we talked about the pay plan for the entire state workforce that we used to have. When I first started with Scenic, there was a pay plan.
Well, it was in law, but it was never
funded.
Right.
And so I had to explain that to him that, that's a noble goal. And yes, we would love to see, that kind of a pay plan for everybody. But if the General Assembly doesn't properly fund it, then it means nothing.
And to be clear, my understanding is that was passed in like the late 90s.
Yeah.
And so Democrats didn't fund it for however many years before Republicans didn't fund it. And eventually they did take that off the books.
Sure did.
A couple of years ago because it was never going to be funded. So people say they want everything based on merit, but when there's a merit component, nobody funded it. So nobody gave anybody incentive to be amazing ever. Ever.
So this week you also spoke in committee, Suzanne, on the proposed DEI bill.
I did. Because it's still that bill that's a solution to hasn't found its problem yet. And we don't understand.
Well, what's DEI?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this bill, filed by Representative Brendan Jones and the co-sponsors that have signed on to it, would remove those kinds of policies from state agency across the board. So,
and those kinds of policies are, what is DEI policy?
I think that's the whole question.
Exactly. No one can say.
Yeah.
Because
that's
the solution part that we're still trying to find the
problem.
And here's the problem with the whole thing, is that people believe when they see that bill, because we get the calls, that there's some sort of quota program in state government, hire this many of this kind of person and whatnot. There is not. There is no quota system in state government. That's not happening. But that's one thing that's believed because of the DEI bill.
My understanding was it was heavily questioned in House rules yesterday afternoon, particularly about the quota. Artis and I were meeting with the speaker, so I was not present for that meeting. But yeah, we still are not sure what that bill is trying to solve. And I did. That's all I said in committee is we just not here to argue a bill. I'm just not sure what it does.
I mean, if there's some big problem, we're just still trying to figure out what it is. But at the same time, it does play into this kind of greater issue of public employees being thought of as not efficient or wasteful, but also that makes it sound like public employees, a lot of them are in their jobs because of immutable characteristic of birth. That's not true. And so
And I said in committee, too.
It's
I
very
mean,
disheartening.
you guys, we're the first people that hear when something like that happens somewhere, we're going to get phone calls.
Complaints. But if you've got a 20% vacancy rate across the board,
you're taking whoever you can get.
Mhm.
well, yeah, there's that. But the demoralization of your workforce seems a really inefficient thing to do in and of itself. Clearly, people don't realize it. I don't think they would intentionally try to hurt people, but we just need them to hear that unless there's some big problem that needs solving with that, it is really demoralizing a lot of people because, what you hear from the employees is that they want to point at people at the top and say, I can tell you who's not qualified. And, this kind of rigmarole just goes round and round and doesn't get you anywhere.
I kind of feel like bills like this are just looking for a fight, that they want folks like us to stand up and shout bloody murder, and we...
Maybe. I mean, but we don't have anything to shout at.
That's
If you
what I'm
don't know
saying.
what it is, you can't shout at it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I extended the invitation in committee. We've invited Representative Jones before committee to join us on the podcast, and that invitation still is open. We'd love to talk about this. We'd love for him to have the opportunity to talk about his bill. So, he's been quite a busy guy.
And as always, we invite anybody who wants to
Yeah.
come on to come on. Because there are so many things that somebody may have a number of stories they've heard or something like that we don't know about. And those are the kind of things that we want people listening to this to have access to. Because when they call here, sometimes we just have to tell them, I'm not real sure why that's happening or why that's out there.
So what are the prospects for that bill? I know it's gone through one committee, right? And
it passed.
It passed both committees this week?
It passed rules
So it'll
yesterday.
be on the floor next week, right? Or...
I would assume it would be on the floor next week, yes.
Okay. We'll be watching that. And then what? Does it go to the Senate, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
The Senate doesn't have a version.
If it passes on the House floor, then...
But there's no Senate
No.
complement to this?
No companion bill.
Okay. Well, good luck with that.
Thanks so much.
Makes me think of Mosby from Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. Good luck with that.
Oh, gosh.
That is-
That's one of those references. But we just talked.
Even I'm too young.
That is my nostalgia.
Too old for
We just talked about a show she'd never heard of. So,
That's true.
I mean, I've at least heard of the show she referenced.
Zach and Cody. Yeah. So I have something to admit. Whenever I hear the term DEI,
Mm-hmm.
I always think of NASCAR, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
That's like what I was thinking the whole time. Anyway,
That's a thing.
That may
Taylor?
be why it rings something inside of me every time I hear the expression.
that was his race team. So
Because Earnhardt, man, he was the man.
Praise hell, praise Dale.
Mhm.
anyway, I digress.
Rubbing his
Sorry about
racing.
that. So the only other topic I had down here was I wanted to kind of ask you both, because you're knowledgeable folks about the retirement system, how the tariffs that have been proposed and the subsequent stock market reaction, how retirees should feel about that. Should they be worried about the reaction? The stock market is
Yeah.
pretty down today. Today is Thursday. I think it was down 3% when we came in here.
Well, number one, Dale Falwell probably feels really vindicated today in his conservative investment style that people keep bashing, because today would be a good day to invest the way Dale invested. But it depends how long this lasts in terms of any fallout in the market from the tariffs. And saw someone from the Treasury, not Treasurer's office here, the U.S. Treasury, who was being interviewed saying we could expect at least a couple of quarters at a minimum of the fallout from the tariffs. In other words, the market remaining suppressed for probably a couple of quarters. In a system our size will probably be okay, but will it take a hit and be that much harder for Treasurer Bronner to build up? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's an analogous situation, but I just think back to when, COVID first hit and there was the significant downturn in the market. And at that time, Treasurer Falwell, and I think everyone was saying, it's a long-term strategy of investment.
Oh, yeah. They were picking on him really bad in the 6 months prior to COVID hitting about the conservatism of his investment approach. And
He's like, see, I told you.
yeah, so then after COVID happened, which of course he had no way of knowing it would happen, the bottom line is anything could happen anytime. And that was kind of his thinking. And certainly there's a more aggressive approach investment-wise that Treasurer Bronner's after. And by more aggressive, I don't mean he doesn't sound like he wants to be at all a super aggressive investor, because it is a pension fund. It's not just somebody's personal money. And so I think he's going to have the proper amount of caution, but it sounds like he does want to take more risk, and that's fine. You have different investment strategies with different treasurers, and
Yeah.
it's going to be okay, but the market will be down for a bit, it looks like.
And I had read something that Bitcoin is actually the reverse, that it would be up during times like this.
Yeah, it'll be kind of like bonds in a weird way.
Yeah, but it started the day going way up, and now it's kind of leveled out. So I'm just checking the old ticker there. But I think that retirees don't have to worry too much, but they do need to be
You always
aware.
hear, and investment planners will tell you not to panic. I mean, I know they do here for us. Our
Sure, you got to
consultant.
hold.
Don't panic. Just sit tight. That's hard. I mean, it's hard not to think about it and hard not to feel some level of fear.
I think 2 quarters into it, if we're still looking at the pain, quote, pain, being extreme, yeah, I mean, you're starting to look into, can you fund the retirement system the way you need to?
Yeah.
And things like that, because it would be a great time for big systems like this one to be buying, but you can't buy if you're not properly funded.
Yeah. Well, that was just a kind of out of the blue question for y'all. I'm sorry to throw that one out there, but I think it's the topic of the day, so we might as well address it. Anything else going on we want to talk about before we get to my awesome question of the week?
I think that covers it. Well, for the biggest thing. For the time, I mean, my goodness.
Yeah, we're probably already over.
Yeah, we're over, I think. But
So this week I consulted Google for a question because I am out of topics. And we kind of talked about them beforehand. And Sam thought this one was a good idea. So play my song.
John's wacky weird question of the week.
All right. So what surprises you about yourself?
Start with me.
Yeah, it's always you.
Always me. I'm the first one. Surprise myself daily. Honestly, my career with Scenic is probably the biggest thing. I was actually having a conversation with a coworker here in the office earlier this morning. She asked me how I even ended up, being a lobbyist for Scenic. So I told her about starting in the finance department, and that artist gave me an opportunity in the legislative affairs department. Next thing I knew, I was sitting in committee meetings and trolling the legislature. So, and here I am today. So I still have moments where, I'm standing in committee. I actually spoke in committee, and I'm like, how did I get here?
Yeah.
So I don't know. This is not what I would have planned for a career. I don't know that you planned for this, but it's been a good one.
Awesome.
So yeah,
I think that's a good one.
Yeah.
Sam, you're next. What shocks you about yourself?
I think how many opportunities I'm willing to take shocks me about myself, because I'm very much a creature of habit. I like my consistency. I don't like big changes, but recently I've been allowing myself to like more big changes. Like when I went to Hawaii, I did a lot of walking around by myself. I am terrified of doing that anywhere in Raleigh. And it's been a big adjustment adapting to knowing that I can do those kinds of things in Raleigh, but it kind of has shocked me being like, dang, I'm a lot more comfortable taking chances now than I used to be.
Great.
that's awesome.
Yeah, that's inspirational.
Because I can remember being a little shy of things.
I think we all
at
remember
age, so
when we first moved out and got out of college, and we were
strike out on your own, be independent. That's cool.
maybe a little afraid of everything.
Oh, I'm still afraid. My parents kicked me off their insurance today, and I had to get my own policy. I was freaking out.
What about you, artists?
Ooh. So I tried to Google an answer since you Googled the question because I was going to use AI to do the work for me.
ChatGPT says.
Yeah. I wasn't very efficient at it, though. So I think that when I watch those commercials for Don't Become Your Parent, and they try to coach people through, don't get on an elevator and talk to everybody. I'm shocked at how many of those little examples where it's making fun of the way people start acting at a certain age,
and we act
just like their parents. Yeah. I'm shocked, surprised, and sometimes appalled at how I do that. I also do that. So, yeah, that would be mine.
That's a good one, too. Yeah,
I love those commercials.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that it really is true. You do become your parents.
I find myself not understanding some technology these days, and my daughter will have to teach me.
So what I'm hearing is I should never own a home because it's saying that homeowners turn into their parents.
So
what I'm hearing,
big time.
I don't need to own a home.
Big
I don't want to
time.
turn into my mom and dad.
Just rent.
Yeah, just rent for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I heard that you should always rent where you live and own where you rent.
Mm-hmm.
So you should rent the house you live in, and then own properties that you rent out.
Me and my friends will buy a beach house one day, and we'll do that.
Sounds like a great strategy.
You have to be
but it
very
also
rich.
Sounds like a lot of capital. Yeah,
I was about to say, it also sounds
to do
very
that.
expensive.
Yeah.
a lot of capital outlay.
I think that mine would probably be how much I like being a dad. When I
Aw.
grew up,
Mm.
when I was growing up,
best.
I've been the baby, so maybe I was a little selfish. But like, I never really thought about it too much, how much I'd want to be a dad. And it's like the best thing on earth.
awesome.
So it's like
That's my favorite answer
my
today.
It
favorite.
is.
my favorite thing in life right now. So that's what shocks me.
Good stuff. Claire's at such a good age.
Yeah. It's just me and her today. Mom is out on work. So
Special
I'm
time.
home single dad tonight. So thanks for everyone for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week.